Taylor served as CEO of JET from 1994 until 2000. He earned his doctorate in mathematics education. Nick worked in the education field for most of his working life as a teacher, subject advisor, evaluator, writer and researcher in the fields of education policy, school effectiveness, and school improvement. Nick served on statutory bodies such as the National Skills Authority and Umalusi. Godwin Khosa served as CEO of JET Education Services for nearly 5 years, from 2009 to 2014, before his appointment as CEO of the National Education Collaboration Trust. While at JET, he headed the NECT Secretariat pending the establishment of the Trust's full-time office. A teacher by profession, Godwin worked as a policy analyst at the Center for Education Policy Development in the 1990s, before joining the Human Sciences Research Council as a research manager. In JET, he served initially as a team leader and then as JET's program director before being appointed CEO in 2009. Godwin has also been a member of the Council of the University of Johannesburg from 2012 to 2022. James Keevy is a policy researcher in the education and training sector. He was appointed CEO of JET in 2014. Prior to that, James was the Director for International Liaisons at the South African Qualifications Authority. A teacher by profession, James has taught at secondary school level and at a teacher's college. His current work focuses on qualifications, recognition of learning, digitalization, and the professionalization and migration of teachers.
Good morning, gentlemen. Fortunately, I'm sitting with the people that I've interacted with throughout my education career. I'm hoping that we'll be able to have a nice conversation today. Most of the questions I'm going to be asking to all three of you, but I will indicate if I need a specific response from a specific person. As a starting point, let's start with the issues that have always been causing a lot of pressure in the school education, transformation and school improvements. What did or does this mean for you as a CEO of JET? And what did you do to address those issues, transformation and school improvements? We can start with anybody. Nick, you want to start?
Teachers are central to the school system, and the school system is central to the rest of the education system. So developing teachers, we've always seen as absolutely key to improving the country's education system, and particularly for those who were disadvantaged under apartheid. So focusing on teachers and teacher improvement at an early stage of JET's development, we were funding something like 70 or 80% of all NGOs who were working on teacher development. And that gave us a strong position in the sector to begin to say, well, how do we improve this development of teachers? How do we improve these in-service training courses of teachers? And that led us into evaluation, assessing the impact of these programs, assessing the extent to which they were improving teacher performance in classrooms, and so on. And of course, pretty soon we also realized that actually you've got to go back earlier. These teachers who are currently in schools are not performing optimally because to a large extent they weren't educated properly in the first place. So that drew us into initial teacher education. And that's become a big focus for us in the last 10 or 15 years because we're realizing that our universities are actually not educating particularly our primary school teachers adequately.
For you, Godwin?
Look, I think Nick is correct in many ways. I mean, teachers are at the center, but to get teachers effective in the classroom, there's a whole lot of connections to the system. So with a management, public management, background, my tenure at JET, focused a little more on the system. We took a little bit more interest in how the system supports the teacher in the classroom. And a bit of that has to do with how you plan and manage the implementation of education policy, which ultimately has to filter into the classroom where the teacher is active. So Nick had started a number of school improvement projects. Some of them were test projects. So we took those further and tested how the system actually supports teachers in the classroom. I think JET learned a lot of lessons on behalf of the education system in South Africa. There's too many complexities around how teachers carry out their tasks in the classrooms. So take for instance the in-service training that Nick was talking about. That has to be planned for by the people who sit in the officials who sit in the system. The in-service training programs have to make educational sense. The in-service program have to be properly resourced. The in-service training programs have to be properly spaced out. So we took a lot of interest in understanding those dynamics, and we kept feeding back into the system, directly, indirectly, formally, and informally. So I think in that sense, JET would have played a strategic role of informing government on where it should go in improving the role of teachers in our estimated over 200,000 classrooms in South Africa. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
James?
Thanks, Peliwe, and thanks for accepting our offer for today. It's much appreciated. We've come a long way together, and I think where we find ourselves today as JET, such an interesting space for me. When I joined JET and building on the work that Nick and Godwin had done, the NECT was just established. So a lot of our school improvement work effectively shifted to the NECT in a very positive way. I mean, the NECT took those ideas and ran with them. I came into JET with more of a post-school education training background. And I said, what is the schooling stuff, guys? It's too difficult to work there. Let's rather work with universities and other places. But the team at JET were consistent that we need to work there. That is what JET is known for. Even today, still, I encounter people that tell me, where does JET work? And I say, we work in schooling and universities and in Africa. And they say, you don't only work in schools. So JET is well known for the legacy that Godwin and Nick and the teams led. But where are we, and what was my learnings the last couple of years in this area, is that by collaborating, we can be more effective. JET is so ideally positioned in the ecosystem to bring together collaborations, and I see a couple of those come together the last while. So I'm excited where we are, Peliwe, but it's been a rocky path. It's been a difficult path for us, and hopefully we can talk more about that today.
I'm listening at you, all of the three of you, and then I realized where we are as a country. Nobody amongst the three of you have talked about that whole big project of bringing all the departments together, of getting schools teaching and assessing to the same standard. Because we kind of put that behind us, but it was a big project. Can you reflect on that, of where we are and what role JET played in that whole process? I'll start with you again, Nick, because you should remember quite a lot about that.
You're referring to the early days?
The early days of getting all the 19, 17 right. or 19 departments right. and getting one single department of education. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in the early days of the democratic government, I think you can talk about the first decade, really. Mm-hmm. An enormous amount was achieved. Something like 19, depending on how you count them, education departments had to be amalgamated into a single department. different racial groups among teachers were paid differently, they had different conditions of service, all that had to be standardized. A massive task, both in terms of HR and in terms of budgeting. And if you recall that in the late 80s, early 90s, schools were actually sites of struggle, particularly the high schools. And so when democracy came, those schools were still enormously unstable. People were not used to going to school on time, staying there the whole day. They were used to burning tires and blocking roads, and all of that had to be stabilized. And I think it's a real credit to those early years of the democratic government that all of that was achieved within a relatively short space of time. After that, things began to go a little haywire, but I think the early days we really can count as a positive in terms of achievement in the school sector in particular as a country.
Anybody? Yeah, yes.
So I always joke, I think I was born at that time, Nick, so I was around. Yeah, thanks, Peliwe. I was actually at a teacher's college at this point, so like in the kind of 95, 96, I'm just reflecting on the period a little bit later than you're talking about. And we were busy implementing OBE. I was training teachers using William Spadey's OBE principles on designing their own curricula. And it was such a fantastic period where I thought like, wow guys, this is amazing. What I realized very quickly that the majority of our teachers, this was foreign to them. For the majority of them, this was going to be so complicated over such a long period. So I very quickly became disillusioned, Peliwe, at that point, with departments merging, with the, I suppose, the early euphoria of the democracy. It waned very quickly where I sat.
Very interesting. I mean, we're talking about, 2 to 3 decades of South Africa's history, and education for that matter. I think the good thing, or a good thread in those 3 decades is about being able to dream and turning dreams into visions. So the whole amalgamation of the 17 departments started with a dream of where South Africa was going, and that was turned into a vision. I mean, a lot of a big part of those visions actually was almost shooting in the dark. But those all policy, propositions of between 1990 and 1998, this is shooting in the dark. I mean, we didn't have experience. We had to, suggest what we thought would work better. But here's the thing. I think JET, in the entire 3 decades, played the role of a temperature gauge.
What do you mean about that?
I'll explain that. So when we thought we had OBE and, JET would go back to classrooms, and check what our kids know, how our kids are actually being taught, what do these policies mean in the classroom, and feedback into the system. And I think that was a very, very strategic role that JET has played. And I think that at this point, it's good to bring in a very important piece of work that Nick oversaw, the Getting Learning Right. I mean, that piece of research, I think, was very useful at that point. It kind of combed across the education system and policies to see what was important, to take further or to focus on to take this country further. So again, that was part of the monitor role, temperature gauge, role. Very important. Let me finish by saying, in the 3 decades, my view is, and a lesson we need to take forward, you don't win at macro development level if you don't have effective institutions like JET. So it was JET, it was the CPD, it was EPUs and so on. You gotta have a close knit of effective institutions that supports government and support the thinking about macro development.
It's nice that you talk about dreams, Godwin. Some of your dreams can turn bad, you know. So OBE was a big dream, James, absolutely. Very soon turned into a nightmare. And getting learning right, Godwin, absolutely right, came out in 1999, just 1 year after the implementation of Curriculum 2005. And that was really a trenchant criticism of that whole approach. So I think you're right, Godwin, you know, strong institutions that look critically, as a critical friend of government at policies, are these going to work? So some of our dreams didn't turn out that way, learning by experience. But you know, now we've got a very solid curriculum. The whole system has stabilized since those days. Learning started improving 15 years ago. So now on all the big international tests, Pearls, TIMS, SACMEC, you name it, the gradient is upwards for South Africa. Slow but steady, but that's probably due to a good curriculum, stable schools, and a steady improvement across the board.
You know, the thing that Godwin and Nick both raised was a little bit important for me around government capacity. You know, so all the things Jet's done for 3 decades has been very reliant and interactive with government of the time, whether it's 1 or 2 departments. What we've seen happening, and particularly the last kind of 7-8 years while I've been at Jet, is that the government departments are waning. They're waning in terms of leadership, they're waning in terms of capacity. So as Jet, we've always been a critical friend to government. So we would criticize government, but not in the media. We would criticize it in-house with the DG or the minister or whoever else. So we played that role, but we've spoken out when we've seen problems. What I've seen the last couple of years is that there's actually just no response to that anymore. It's as if the government departments have become so fatigued with the criticism that we're just like on a spiral where capacity in government is a major problem.
Maybe I should start with you then, James, on my next question, because you already have led me into it. The kind of challenges that you have faced in doing your work. And I'm asking all of you because you have been CEO at Jet at totally different phases in our government space.
I think civil society working together in a coordinated way. And Godwin, you've been close with me around this as the NECT the last couple of years. We set up an association of non-profits. It's called NASCI. Godwin and I did a radio interview a while ago, and we had to say NASCI. We had to spell out the acronym 5 times. So it's a National Association for Social Change Entities in Education, NASCI. We've got 126 NGOs, civil society members that are working together with us in a collective. And I think the challenge, Peliwe, has been to get those civil society to work together in a more coordinated way. Civil society, in some sense, has been set up as competitors to each other and competitors to consultancies. So instead of us supporting government in niche areas, we get treated like consultancies, and we actually treat each other like consultancies. And that competition can be healthy, of course, but it can also waste a lot of time and effort. So I think one of the key things I would take away is civil society not working well enough together, but there's light at the end of the tunnel. I can add a lot more organizationally, but let's maybe park that for now.
Challenges for you?
Well, challenges indeed. I mean, I suppose what would actually make Jet relevant at any point in time is the existence of challenges. So that's business, you know, for Jet, so to say. I mean, my challenge when I was CEO of Jet was to try and find a common understanding between, you know, Jet and the various other key players such as government, and we even explored working with unions, you know, teacher unions, and of course the private sector and the NGOs. I'm very happy, you know, James is continuing with the NGO bit. Let me start with the private sector. I mean, the private sector in South Africa has been very good to education. They put a lot of money. I mean, in the past, you know, 10 years, we're talking a good 2 to 5 billion rands that are being put into education. But the investment is being put in a haphazard manner. And oftentimes it has, you know, unintended effects. Oftentimes, business people, most of whom come from communications background, get into educational matters that they don't understand well. They design programs and so on and so forth. So we got into that space, and we got, business to try and understand better that education is complex and it needs to be left to educationists, and that JET was in the best place, to design, those programs for them. We won somewhat, and I think that's continuing. We explored working relationships with teacher unions. Actually, for my interview, I went to the SATU office, and I did say to the board when they interviewed me, I said, I went to the SATU office. The building had so many cracks outside. It's downtown. Across them, there's a brothel going on. But inside, I found the lift works. I went into the bathroom. There was a toilet paper. And it was clean. And I said, when I speak to them, they look like they've got blood in their blood vessels. And there's potential, to work with these people. So anyway, that continued, and I think we made quite good progress working with the unions, because you can't throw them away. They are our unions. We've got to bring them in line. And then the third was government. And by the way, practically, I walked straight into the minister's office. I set up an appointment, and she gave me a seat. I sat across the table and said, my belief is that as the Minister of Education, you're the minister of the 9 departments and the minister of the many NGOs that are within the borders and many private sector organizations that want to help you. So let's talk, how can JET help you? So, and I think we strike a very good relationship. They start understanding that actually JET is there to facilitate additional support to improving, education. And then comes the NGO bit. We had to mix that with our approach to, systemic approach to education support. But those challenges, I think, were turned into advantages, because we started playing with all those, players, and it worked well, for JET.
Nick, you want to take a bite?
Yeah, both of my colleagues have mentioned the question of capacity as a problem. It is undoubtedly the country's biggest problem. Now, capacity is not just what people can do and what they know. It's also the development, the production of capacity. Where does it come from? Yeah. It's the utilization of capacity. How do you use it? And then ongoing, how do you keep developing it? And I think we're failing on all 3 of those fronts, actually. We've spoken about initial teacher education. That's a problem. Our primary school teachers are going into schools. Most of their language skills are poor, even in their home languages. They don't know the primary school maths curriculum, and they have no idea how to teach reading. Go figure. Why are we failing as a country? Our teachers don't know how to teach. We've spoken about that one. The next big problem is how this capacity is used. So what little capacity we have in the country is not most effectively optimized. So do we appoint people on the strength of their expertise? Do we select subject advisors because they're the best maths teacher in the school? Or do we select them because we know their brother, or they've paid us money, or they're a member of the country's biggest union? We are not utilizing our capacity best because we are not following the best human resource policies. So, and of course, accountability. People kind of get into government and now they can do as they like. And a lot of that involves corruption, and there's no comeback often. Well, we are starting to see some of that. Hopefully the corner has turned on corruption, but it has been a massive problem and remains so.
Can I interrupt you and ask you a question?
Yes.
You see JET from the outside for 3 decades. What is your kind of sense of where JET's gone over the 3 decades?
I think JET had been a very good force in school education in terms of making us understand where the problems are, in terms of influencing the policies and the direction, and in particular the improvements and how to go about improvements in the schooling system. I guess I've kind of lost track with JET when I got out of the schooling system. But when I was still very much more involved in the schooling system, I would look up and read a lot about what JET says. They've been an authoritative voice, in particular in the curriculum space, in the teacher development. and in the monitoring and improving school system. I want to go over to the audience. Natalie, do you have a questions for the three panels?
Given the discussions that we're having, I would like to know from the three CEOs, when you set out as a CEO of JET, what was your vision, and do you think that you've actually achieved that vision at the end of your tenure as CEO of JET?
My vision was, I saw a lot of activity. One of South Africa's strengths is its civil society. We are blessed with a large number of NGOs. As James has said, that can be a disadvantage if they're not working together. But I saw this as an opportunity to actually understand what the impact of the NGOs was on the school system and teacher development in particular. And that necessitated us to start developing evaluation and research skills. And I think we've been quite instrumental actually in the country in taking forward the agenda of evaluation, making it more widespread among these activities. Because people, in the early days, they used to assume our intentions are good, therefore we must be doing good work. But actually there's many a slip between intentions and implementation, as we know. And evaluation and research is the key to closing that gap. So I think over the last 30 years, in fact, JET has really been instrumental in pushing the agenda of evaluation, developing capacity, developing awareness about it, and making sure that, that these kinds of activities are strongly, rigorously evaluated, and the lessons distributed. And one of the problems with evaluation is that if you get a positive result, of course, you trumpet it everywhere. If you get a negative result, you hide the report in a cupboard. And that's a problem, because those negative evaluations are as important. This is the thing you must not do if you get a negative evaluation. There's no shame in that. We tried our best. It didn't work. We've got to try something else. So that's the next frontier of evaluation for me, is publicizing the negative lessons as well.
So, I mean, when I got into, it used to be Nick's office, my first intention was to continue with the transition, which I think was an important, win, particularly between Joint Education Trust and JET Education Services. I think that was a fantastic, transition from a completely funded, donor-funded or private sector-funded trust to a self-sustaining, organization. So the books were not looking very good, and I thought, we're gonna look at, strengthening the transition. So the first thing I looked at was to go through a beta organizational re-engineering. Fortunately, I knew a bit of JET, before, and changed the structures. And importantly, I mean, we went through interviewing people for new positions at JET. And my whole intention was actually to make a transition or finalize the transition from working with project managers to educationists. The period before required us to have lots of project managers to manage donor funding and so on. The period that I was managing required educationists with educational ideas that we had to sell, to the system. So I think we did, fairly well. It was very bitter. We had to move people around and lose some people. And look, I think we succeeded, and particularly given that I had a young team, Carla, Anthony, and then we brought Michelle, each of them as divisional heads, and they ran much faster. And I used to say to them, if you're going to work successfully with the system, you must mark somebody in the system like you're playing a soccer game against them. So I said, go and mark somebody. Influence, bring back, work to do and that sort of thing. So I think it was a good, successful, period in in finalizing or tightening up that transition that started almost 10 years, before I joined JET. And secondly, the fact that the NECT, which has raised and invested over 2.5 billion rands in the past 8 to 9 years, the fact that it was founded from JET, I think it's a big win, and I think it's a big win not just for JET but for the country. So that's part of what I thought the team contributed to the country during my tenure at JET.
So thanks, Natalie, for the question. I wish I had this discussion with my two colleagues next to me 10 years ago. Now, when I joined JET, I don't know, Peliwe, I came from SAQA at the time, SAQA. I don't think I really know what I let myself in for. Can I be honest? JET was in a difficult place, and it's interesting, organizations go through cycles. We've just heard 2 cycles. So this is not anybody's fault or anything, it was a new cycle. And it was a tough cycle. The first 3-4 years was just about sustainability. It wasn't about fancy research, it wasn't about doing new models and systemic change, it was about survival. That's all it was. And the one lesson I've learned in this period was that culture in an organization is much more important than strategy. All the business people tell us this. I don't like business books, I don't read business books, but there's one thing that I know. Culture matters. And what we did over that first 5-6 years was focus on culture. Who is the team? What is the team like? Is the team quality focused? Can they take the pace? A lot of people dropped off during that period. So that was what I set out to do. Nothing fancy, just focus on culture. And guess what? Culture takes the longest to change. So it's actually been a difficult journey, but we're out of it and we're in a good place now, Natalie. Thanks.
Okay. I'm still going to ask a question to any of you, if you so wish. The public always doesn't get some aspects of our education right. There are some major misconceptions that are out there about our education system. Can you just pick some of your pet peeves? I've got my pet peeves of what the public thinks about our education, especially schooling education.
Yeah, my pet peeve, Peliwe, is if you change the curriculum, you're going to change the school system. Forget about it. And we keep making that mistake, and we still make it, and it's not just the public that thinks this. It's highly placed officials in the education system as well that seem to think that. And you see it across the world, actually. There are these crazes about competency-based curricula or outcomes-based curricula, and everyone thinks, yes, if only we could do that, we would change the way teachers teach and learners learn. It's a myth. Good teachers can teach almost any curriculum well. Bad teachers can't teach the best curriculum at all. Okay. And that's the problem. It's teachers, not the curriculum.
Let's go to Godwin and James. What are your pet peeves?
Well, it's about finding and sustaining energy in the system and in the sector to improve. I find that a lot of the solutions that are being suggested are old and tired, and people don't want to think forward. We got to find ways of generating ideas. So take, for instance, the example that Nick is giving. It's a global wave, this competency-based curriculum. So you got to participate in the global wave, but the core in the country has to be strong, in order for it to select what we can take and what we can't take, how we actually make a transition into the future. And the NECT, and hopefully we'll be working with JET amongst others, is now creating space for us to go back into the classroom to understand what's happening in the classroom.
Okay. James.
I want to hear your peeve as well, Peliwe. My pet peeve is that after nearly 30 years of democracy, we haven't got it right. Really. You know, it's like embarrassing when one is in the international community and we show the results. Now, Nick, yes, there's an upwards trajectory, but from such a low base, we know that.
Of course.
And we're part of this generation, Peliwe. So for me, the issue is, this is not about pointing fingers. We are the generation that in these last 27, 28 years have been focusing on the system, and it's not working. That's my pet peeve, and I think we're all accountable for it, and we need to talk about this.
Okay, I'm going to name my own pet peeves, and maybe you can explain why they are myths. One is the 30% pass rate in matric. Secondly is about anything that is in society, we need to put it in the curriculum in the schools.
Yeah.
Thirdly, that we are rate number last in all countries, in all tests that we test. Can somebody respond to that as to why are those myths in our society?
Is it glass half full or half empty? I think,
Especially the 30% pass mark in matric.
I think the glass is half full, honestly. And it requires educationists who understand to make an objective, argument. Personally, I won't worry much about the 30%, pass rate. I will worry a lot more about what proportion of our matriculants pass with a 60 or 70.
Yeah.
Right. So I'll focus there and say every year we must increase the number that pass with those higher grades. This 30% thing, it's a glass half empty, and it's taking away the eye from the right things, right? So, yeah.
Can I quickly go? I mean,
but it's not true, it's a myth.
Of course.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a myth.
So let's talk about myths. We work in the NQF space, and the acronym for NQF is sometimes no quick fixes. My kind of peeve around this, Peliwe, is that we just want to fix everything quickly. We don't get the basics right, and we don't do it over a long period and plan over 10, 20 years. And it's self-inflicted. So what we're doing here is the public is not trusting us anymore, because every time we say we do something, 5 years later, we're doing something different. So we've lost the trust of the public, and I think this is something we also need to be accountable for collectively, not only JET.
Okay. Now let's move on. Let's talk about COVID. COVID-19 has been a major pandemic. Some would say that it has been a game changer. Some would say it has been a major disruptor. But we've heard it, and we're going to live with the repercussions of what we have heard in the last 2 years. Can you talk a little bit about how you think both JET and government should respond to what we have just experienced?
If I can start, I mean, we should acknowledge as the country, in education in particular, that this is the first kind of, crisis that is not man-made, that we have to manage. We've managed strikes before, but we've not managed disaster, to this level. I think the good thing is that that's a wake-up call, for the system, because we can expect more disasters, in the future. I think how, JET could be playing a role there is to help improve the understanding of how deep the disruption has gone into the education system. So whether it's in terms of how less learners know, or how much of the teaching or education processes have been disrupted. Because honestly, coming up with recovery plans without that kind of evidence, it's foolish.
Anyone has got something to say?
It's a difficult question.
Yeah, it's a good point, Godwin. I mean, COVID, there have been some positive aspects. We do more meetings by Zoom now, and it's a very efficient way of having meetings. Saves a lot of time. But COVID has been an unmitigated disaster for education. There's no question. most of the country has lost a year's worth of learning. But those kids in middle class schools, their education was hardly disrupted. So in fact, not only is it lost learning for most of us, but it's widened inequalities. And the way back from that is to actually, not just a catch-up program. I mean, we need intensive extra time at school. Otherwise, this generation is going to go through its life with this big gap in its education system. And you know, the secret to actually catching up really is to have a national effort. And the fact that we can't get this is really indicative of how disrupted we are as a nation, how we don't pull together. And you know, if I had one wish, I would say, if the president could somehow pull us together around that issue and get extra time in school and extra effort by teachers and learners, it would go a long way to catching up this disaster that we've had.
I want to ask you.
Thank you.
I want to go to Pat. Pat, do you have a question for the panel?
Good morning, gentlemen. To follow on the last question, the pandemic has caused us all to rethink what we are doing and where we are going. Still, we follow logical pathways, but there has been an impact on our psychosocial. How do you think psychosocial aspects will affect what we do in the future, and how will you in fact address these?
Can I
Yes,
continue?
yes, please.
Yeah, I think, Pat, you put your finger on it. This is the issue that's exposed our country, hey, that we've got a massive problem as a society. And so how can parents that are being exposed to many of these things in their own lives support their children? I'm not even talking about academically, I'm talking about their own psychosocial kind of conditions. I think it's an area that is a game changer for the country, and we need to get it, and COVID has shown us the opportunity. The work we're starting to do now around parental and community involvement is trying to get into that space. I think there's something there that can make a massive difference. So I see that as an opportunity.
I was going to ask you a question about your achievements, but I think you have done a lot of explaining what you set out to do, what you think you have done, and what, so it's quite evident. Instead, I'll go to Rory and ask her to ask a question.
Thank you, Prof. My question is around the transformation of the education sector in South Africa in the mid-1990s. If we had an opportunity to do it all over again, what could we do differently?
And you had all the money to do it with.
So I can start maybe just
Yes.
because the money prompts me a little bit.
Yeah.
If we had all the money, and actually we had all the money, and we actually largely still have it. Money is not the problem in South Africa. Money is not the problem. It's a capacity, it's an attempt of many of the things we spoke about today to coordinate better and to work on the basics. We jump to all this fancy stuff all the time and we just waste money. So I think if we could do it, and hindsight's always an exact science, so you know, it's a question is difficult, but I think we should have got stuck to the basics, and we should have built on the good things out of the apartheid education system. I mean, that's a controversial thing to say, but in South Africa we threw the baby out so many times in education as well. So we took OBE and we said, let's take this fancy thing happening in the northern countries, and we just chucked everything out that was good around the education system. There were many bad things, but we chucked the whole thing out. And so I think really there are a couple of lessons for me there. But as I say, it's an exact science when you look back.
I'm not as old as James, so I'll remember or know the apartheid things that we should have kept and so on. But if I had the opportunity and the space, I would have put a lot more emphasis on talent management for the system, making sure that we have the right people, able people, capable people in key positions, then and into the future. And maybe by so doing, get JET out of business, because government would have been able to do what it's supposed to do without being handheld. And I think that's still something that we have to focus on. A good measure of our success, of the success of those who support government, should be actually getting ourselves out of business.
Yeah,
Your
that's
wish,
such a
Nick?
good point,
Yeah.
Godwin, talent management. But the question for me is, why are we not managing our talent better? And you know, to some extent, Rory, it's not what could we have done better. It's a question of what have we learned and where are we now and where do we go forward. I mean, I think, you know, for a country to come from the past that we've had, it's not just apartheid, by the way, it's 350 years of colonialism and apartheid and racial discrimination and selfishness and money grabbing and exploitation. What have we learned from all of this, and how can we go forward better? Well, the question really is in our public representatives. What have they learned? Because I look back on 30 years and I see the same thing that happened the previous 350 years. Politicians are after themselves, they're after their friends and family, they're not working in the interests of the country. And if we as a country were to learn anything, that would be the next step for me. And actually I see it happening. You know, I'm seen as an optimist. All my friends and family are emigrating, they're leaving the country, they're writing it off. I'm saying, listen, we've learned some huge lessons here, and I think we're going to go forward. And the way the electorate is speaking to the politicians encourages me in that direction. We've got strong institutions, we've got a strong legal system, we've got an independent judiciary, we've got a strong civil society and an independent press, and it's pulled us out of a hole, all of those things, and we seem to be on an upward trajectory now. So you can see I'm an optimist. And
I will zoom on you, James. If you could just tell us a little bit about your research agenda to improve education, as well as give us a glimpse to the future of JET.
Thanks, Peliwe. At least I could prep for one question. But let me keep it short, and you can cut me as well. I think building on the teacher education work that in Godwin and Nick's time was the foundation is important to us, and we keep building in that. But we're trying to look a little bit deeper around that, particularly around alternative models for teacher education. A lot of our kids have just this academic route, and actually there's vocationally orientated kids that can get into teaching that are pretty good kids. I always use the example of my son. I won't repeat it today. Not for his benefit, just in case he watches this video. But the issue is that there are many kids that want to do teaching, but they're not academically. And so they don't get into university and they can't become teachers, but they're actually pretty good teachers. I think there's something there that we're building on as we speak, Peliwe. But I think a key thing that's come through for me this morning is JET's not all about school education. You know, there's a lot of work that JET is doing at the moment in Africa, like working with refugees. Refugees are coming to South Africa and are moving around in Africa in a way that they are exploited like in unbelievable ways. Cody, who's in the audience now, is just back from Zambia last week, where he went to a refugee camp. And we're looking at ways how we can help with skills recognition of refugees. Now that's a completely different world from school education. Another area our research agenda is taking us is around data and understanding data. We see in PSET and post-school education and training in South Africa, we've got a lot of pockets of data, whether it's NSFAS, whether it's DHET, whether it's a university or whether it's a college. These data sets don't talk to each other. So a lot of our research at the moment is going into data, understanding what interoperability in data systems mean, and what data privacy means for a future 2030, 2040 world that we live in. So what we're trying to do with the JET research agenda, to summarize, we're building on the good things that have come out, but we're also looking much more futuristic around what lies ahead for South Africa and countries across the world. And I think we're in a good space. Our team has grown that works in these kind of areas, and it's become very diverse and very young. And a lot of young black researchers are growing in the organization. This is a key thing. Whenever Godwin and I talk, we talk about this, okay? And I'm telling you, looking at our staff at the moment, I think somebody told me the other day, you told me, Nick, what are all these young people doing here? And we've got competent young black researchers. So that might sound like a trivial thing, but actually it's not a trivial thing. You know, you can have this fancy research agenda, but we're building young, competent researchers. Daniel, who's sitting in the audience, has just been promoted to a senior statistician. Now, I don't know, Daniel, whether you like 31 or 32, whatever your age is, but you know, Daniel is punching above his weight. Why? He came through an internship at JET. Many of the people that work with us come through that route. But it takes time, and it takes too long. And so that's a couple of high-level things. I can add much more.
That also relates to the first question about transformation. It looks like JET also is living the example of transforming its own operation, its own internal personnel. Time flies. You know, we're almost at the end of our time for this session. But for the last question, I would like to find out, do you have any questions you would like to each other, gentlemen?
It's tough, but I can try. I can start and let's get the ball rolling. So I would ask both Godwin and Nick if they were currently the CEO of JET, because now I've got the privilege of being the current, and they've gone on with their lives and doing different things, but what would they do differently currently as JET? You know, are we missing anything? Is there anything we can do better? Can I start with Godwin? Put him on the spot.
So, and you know, I may be wrong, but I mean, one of the things that I thought I would do like towards the end of my term at JET was I was going to take the private sector participants in this education sector for a run for the rand. So I believe that JET had all the systems and all the people and all the knowledge to actually do a better consulting work in the education space than any other like private sector firms. And I think that it's worth exploring. Build it up, you know, slowly. We know education. JET, and I said we know education. JET knows education. JET can actually provide better advisory from a consultancy point of view. It's a more lucrative market, and in fact, whatever margins that can or profits that can be raised from that can be plowed back into the other developmental, you know, work of JET. I think it's something that to explore.
So the CEO of the CHE at the moment, Whitty Green, once told, I think he told you, Nick, that JET is a think tank, do tank. And you know, I've kind of latched onto that a little bit. You know, we can think and research, but we can do as well. Yeah. And it ties back to what Godwin says, you know, but the difficulty for us is the current legislation, JET's a non-profit. So if we compete unfairly with for-profits, we get into tricky territory. Yeah. Can I just ask Nick one question, Peliwe, and then I'll be done? Yeah. So, you know, when I joined JET, I had the chairs in the office. I know, Godwin, you also used them, but I knew Nick was on them. You know, I was like, people telling me like, you can't sit on that chair. You know, that was Nick and Godwin's kind of space. And I just felt, you know, there was such a respect in the organization for my predecessors and the way they came. You know what I actually did with that chair? I gave it to somebody else. And I said, Andrew,
really?
I took the chair. I said, Andrew, this is now your chair. And I took a different chair. But I just want to give you a sense of kind of the kind of respect for what happened in JET over many years. And for both Godwin and Nick. But of course, Nick was first. And laid an incredible foundation. And my respect for both Nick and Godwin, but in this case now Nick, for staying with JET. You know, Nick could have gone on and sat on a veranda, as we spoke just now, and sipped wine, but Nick is still contributing. So there's something about JET that we always say, once a JET setter, always a JET setter. People don't go.
What's the question?
Sorry, am I doing a speech?
I still sit on a veranda and drink wine, by the way.
Okay, so my question to Nick is, Nick, what would you do differently now if you were the CEO?
Well, I would learn from you, James, and from Godwin. You know, every organization goes through organizational development crises, and it needs to adjust sometimes its format, so from a trust to an NPO, but usually it's the way it manages its people. And that happens particularly as you grow in size. You know, you start off as a small family that know each other and just work together, and gradually it goes on. And you have built a huge organization now, James. But going back to what you said earlier, culture is absolutely key. And if I had to do things differently, I would have focused more on the culture. It is just so important. And you know, I said it the other day at our lunch. JET is a happy place to be. Everyone feels comfortable, they feel they're going places. And that is so important. And I see all these young people loving their jobs at Jet and really being interested and attentive to what they do.
Even pet.
Even
He said young people.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying.
Young at heart.
I think that we must end here, ladies and gentlemen, because we can go on and on with there's so many questions to ask and so many answers that we should give. But thank you to all three of you for making JET as an organization. Many NGOs disappear. I'm sure your peers are no longer. I was thinking available. I was thinking about CPD. Who was CPD? And then I remember who that was.
Yeah.
And we have to thank you even now as a country, as the people who are interested in education involved, for the contribution that you have made. Thank you very much.